welcome everyone. Ambassador Burns, thank you for being here with us today. As you can see from the full house, our members are very interested in what you have to say. We'll talk for about 40 minutes, then you'll take questions from the audience for about 30 minutes, and then everyone will buy the book, which is for sale out in the lobby, and Ambassador Burns will sign it up here. So that's the plan. Following a stellar 33-year diplomatic career, State reluctantly let you go in October 2014. I would ask how retirement is going, but no one has spotted you on the golf course quite yet. Right after leaving State, you took on the job of president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And through these past few especially challenging years, we've been waiting to hear from you. And now we are. You have a newly published but already best-selling book. It's making headlines and helping all of us be more articulate about the value of diplomacy today. So I just want to say thank you for that from everyone here. And congratulations, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
So diplomacy is not usually on the top of the bestseller list. So I wonder if you could tell us why you think this book is resonating right now.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Shawn, for those very kind words. And it's great to be with all of you. This book came out about 3 weeks ago, so I've been running around doing lots of book talks. But none of those has had the meaning that this one does for me, to be with a group of people for whom I have such respect and from whom I've learned so much over the years. So thank you very much for taking the time to come today. And I hope you'll all enjoy the book as well. I mean, I really wrote it for two reasons. First, as a memoir, and then second, as an argument. The memoir is pretty straightforward. I mean, as all of you know as well as I do, diplomacy may be one of the oldest of human professions, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. We oftentimes do operate in back channels, out of sight and out of mind. And I was really fortunate over 3.5 decades as a professional diplomat to play a modest role in some of the most significant events in post-Cold War American foreign policy. You know, from the highs of the end of the Cold War when I worked for Secretary Baker, to the lows of the Iraq War a decade later, secret talks with the Iranians, the turbulence of the Arab Spring, and then the return of great power rivalry as well. And along the way, like many of you, I dealt with a kaleidoscope of foreign leaders, from Muammar Gaddafi to Vladimir Putin. And I've always thought, as either a diplomat or an author, if you can't get color out of Gaddafi and Putin, you need to find a different profession. But the argument is also pretty straightforward. I mean, over those 3.5 decades as a diplomat, I've never seen a moment when diplomacy mattered more to advancing American interests in the world or been more adrift. Mattered more because we're no longer the only big kid on the geopolitical block today with the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia. I would still argue that we have a better hand to play than any of our rivals, not only military and economic leverage, but also our capacity for drawing on alliances and mobilizing coalitions of countries. And diplomacy, again, as all of you know as well as I do, ought to be our principal tool, our tool of first resort to take advantage of that asset. And what I worry about today is that we're corroding that tool and squandering that asset. And I would be the first to acknowledge that it's not as if President Trump invented the drift in American diplomacy. You know, we've wrestled through the course of my career after the end of the Cold War with a sense of complacency sometimes in the United States and in Washington in particular, which made it difficult to justify not only budgets but broader support for diplomacy. And then, of course, after the deep shock to our system on 9/11, we tended to further emphasize military and intelligence tools and treat diplomacy sometimes as a kind of under-resourced afterthought. I would, however, argue that in the last 2.5 years, that drift has been accelerated and made infinitely worse. And hence my concern in trying to write this book, not only to illuminate diplomacy for a wider audience in this country and hopefully outside this country, but also to make the argument that renewing diplomacy, I think, is more critical than ever to advancing American interests on a much more crowded, contested, and complicated international landscape than the one I encountered in January 1982 in the A100 course.
Yeah, thanks. One of the things you do in a masterful job with in the book is weaving storytelling in with wisdom on statecraft, offering an entry point for readers who may not know a lot about diplomacy. So I thought we'd start with a few illustrative anecdotes because they're just great stories. You write about meeting Gaddafi in the Libyan desert in 2005. You were the NEA Assistant Secretary then. Can you tell us something about that meeting and why you came away from that feeling hopeful and why you chose that for the book?
Well, yeah, hopeful might have been a strong term in meeting Gaddafi, because he was by far the most peculiar foreign leader with whom I ever dealt. I remember the one of the meetings I describe in the book was kind of like a scene from that old Steve Martin, John Candy movie, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. So, you know, you fly in on this was in the period when we were doing quiet talks with the Libyans over Lockerbie to get them to take responsibility, to get them to pay compensation to the families of the victims, to get out of the business of terrorism, and then ultimately to give up what was a rudimentary nuclear program. And the British helped facilitate these talks through the period. So anyway, that's how I came to encounter Muammar Gaddafi. I remember this one meeting, which was long after midnight, since she specialized in doing meetings when I was usually dead tired. And he had this really disconcerting habit when you'd be talking to him of staring up at the ceiling in mid-conversation for 3 or 4 minutes, where I presume he was gathering his thoughts. But it was a little strange for a diplomat, because we're all trained to carry on conversations. Fortunately, he's a very flashy dresser. So on this occasion, he was wearing what was sort of a pajama top with photographs of dead African dictators on it. So I would spend the 3 or 4 minutes while he's staring at the ceiling trying to guess how many dead African dictators I could identify. And fortunately, he paused a lot in that conversation, and so I, did a pretty good job guessing those. But, despite all of his peculiarities, and I remember another instance, some of you may remember, when he spoke to the United Nations General Assembly in the fall of 2009, and, leaders are theoretically supposed to limit themselves to 10 minutes or so. Gaddafi went on for 90 minutes. He had all these scraps of paper. He didn't have a text in front of him, scattered all over the podium, and he would, some would fall off the podium, and he'd try to assemble others. And I remember distinctly, because I was listening to the UN Arabic language interpreter, who was terrific. I had known him before. And about 75 minutes into the conversation, I hear this, "I can't take this anymore." And he took off his headphones and stormed out of the booth,
Wow.
So a sign of his good judgment. But anyway, there's a moral to this, in that I think, that was an illustration of what you can achieve through diplomacy, because as peculiar, as bloodily repressive as Gaddafi was over the years, I had a friend with whom I had served in Jordan at the very beginning of my career. A CIA officer was killed on Pan Am 103. He was stationed in Beirut. He was on his way home to see his wife and 2 young daughters for Christmas. So, that never left my mind when I was talking to Gaddafi or his senior officials. But we managed to use diplomacy backed up by a lot of leverage to produce an outcome that I think suited American interests quite well. It didn't change the fact that, Gaddafi was a ruthless and deeply repressive leader, which ultimately was his undoing a decade later when a revolution began in Libya. But at least it stripped away that nuclear program and that capacity for engaging in terrorism that had resulted in so much bloodshed over the years.
Yeah.
Nice guy. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
So I'd like to move us to another nice guy. The part of the book where you talk about presenting your credentials to Vladimir Putin is particularly interesting. What was that meeting like, and what did it tell you about Putin and Russia's changing world view?
In general in Russia, and I served twice in Moscow over the course of my checkered career, first in the early 90s in Boris Yeltsin's Russia. And I always thought, if you want to understand the kind of smoldering aggressiveness of Vladimir Putin's Russia, it helps to understand the disorder and the chaos which characterized much of Boris Yeltsin's Russia. When I served in Moscow in the early 90s, it really was a kind of kaleidoscope of chaos. I remember, going to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, during the first Chechen War, winter of 1994-95. And I'd never seen anything like the devastation that I witnessed then. 40 square blocks in Grozny, which were leveled. I mean, they looked like photographs of Dresden, 1945. The Russian general who was responsible for that later said publicly that he wanted to make the rubble bounce, and he did. The sad thing was that most of the civilians who were killed in that bombing were elderly ethnic Russians who couldn't get out of Grozny. They couldn't escape. But here was the Red Army that, at the height of the Cold War was supposed to be able to get to the English Channel in 48 hours. They looked more like a street gang. I mean, albeit a street gang with nuclear weapons. But, they were having huge difficulty suppressing a local rebellion in an isolated part of Russia. And so that, for people like Putin, and people especially who were professionally trained in the security services in Russia, this was a deep source of humiliation. And so when he came to power, now almost 2 decades ago, he was determined, I think, to do 2 things. First was to restore the power of the Russian state. And the second was to restore Russia to what he believed was the place it was entitled to at the table of great powers in the world. So I vividly remember that first meeting as the newly arrived ambassador in the summer of 2005 with Putin. Those of you who have served in Moscow, or been in the Kremlin, where this ceremony takes place, know that it's built on a scale that's meant to intimidate visitors, especially newly arrived American ambassadors. So you go through these huge ornate halls, down long corridors. You come to the end of one hall, and there are these 2-story bronze doors. And you kept waiting there for a little while just to let all this sink in. And then the door cracks open a bit, out comes Vladimir Putin, who, despite his bare-chested persona, is not the most intimidating person in the flesh, but he carries himself with a lot of self-assurance. So he comes through the door, looking me dead in the eye, which is his habit. And before I could get a word out of my mouth, let alone hand over my letter of credentials, said, "You Americans need to listen more. You can't have everything your own way anymore. We can have effective relations, but not just on your terms." I mean, that was vintage Putin. It wasn't subtle. It was kind of defiantly charmless. But he was delivering a message that, Russia wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. And, I've always thought in diplomacy, again, as all of you know as well as I do, that you don't have to, indulge somebody else's perspective. You don't have to accept it, but you got to understand it as the starting point for effective policy. And, both we and the Russians over the course of the, almost 30 years now since the end of the Cold War have had our illusions about how to manage that relationship. But the reality, I think, that we face now with Putin's Russia is that we have a pretty narrow range of possibilities before us, from the sharply competitive to the nastily adversarial. It is important within that narrow band, to preserve some guardrails in the relationship, which is why I think, with the expiration of the INF agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, likely this summer, it's really important to try to preserve the New START treaty, which reduces and regulates strategic nuclear weapons as well. Because, diplomacy, again, as all of you know very well, oftentimes is about managing complicated relationships with adversaries. And you need to build some habits of communication and some guardrails into those relationships.
Yeah. You've spoken about how today's Foreign Service faces a more disordered world.
Mm-hmm.
What would you see as the top priority issues that the U.S. should be focusing on today?
Yeah, well, my nostalgia is under control these days as a recovering diplomat. I don't envy all of you who are still serving, because it's a really complicated world. And, well, as I said before, I think the United States still has a better hand to play than any of our major power rivals, far out as I can see into the 21st century. It's still a really complicated landscape to navigate. So, I guess I would say among the biggest priorities, I think the existential challenge is climate change. And that's a place where diplomacy is enormously important. I think it was a huge mistake to bail out of the Paris Climate Treaty. And I hope very much that, in the process of renewing diplomacy, it can be harnessed to a more sensible approach on climate as well. The revolution in technology is another of those big overarching global challenges that no one country and certainly no one government is going to be able to, solve on its own. But there is a need, akin in some ways to the need for some workable international rules of the road at the dawn of the nuclear era 60, 70 years ago, for the beginnings of some international rules of the road on technology issues that, can maximize the benefits of artificial intelligence and drone technology and synthetic biology, but also minimize their dislocations because they're quite real. So that's another big challenge. And then, of course, there's China and great power rivalry. I mean, that's China's rise is the single most consequential challenge on the international landscape and the single biggest test, I think, for American statecraft and diplomacy. It's kind of fashionable in Washington now to talk about containing China's rise. It strikes me, and I'm no China expert, that another way of looking at it is that we can shape the environment into which China rises, because we have a lot of cards to play across Asia if we play them wisely. There's a web of countries from India through Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia that share our concern, even if they don't want to be forced to make choices between China and the United States. They share our concern that China's rise not come at the expense of their prosperity and security. So what that involves is investing in alliances, investing in emerging partnerships like the US-India partnership, and it means molding institutions. And that's why, again, I thought it was a huge mistake to bail out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The big trade agreement that would have knit together 40% of the global economy and inevitably would have shaped China's own incentives and disincentives to compete effectively across Asia. And so, I agree with what President Trump is trying to do in pushing back against predatory Chinese trade and investment practices. That's probably overdue. But I think the tactics strike me as being pretty badly flawed. In the sense that logically what you'd want to do is make common cause with other countries who share those same concerns, like the European Union and Japan, instead of starting second and third front trade conflicts with them over steel and aluminum. And you also need to couple that defensive strategy, pushing back against those practices, with a more affirmative vision for the kind of Asia that, Americans at least want to see. And hence the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the value of institutions like that. So there are lots of other challenges out there, among which are, renewing American diplomacy as well as our principal tool for trying to navigate that landscape.
Yeah. Now, so on China, the Director of National Intelligence recently said that the U.S. was asleep for the last 15 years, and I'm wondering if you think we're late to this great power competition.
Yeah.
And part of the question, as far as the Foreign Service role, we're now outnumbered in many places all over Africa, I think many countries in Latin America, by the Chinese diplomats on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And what should we do now?
Yeah, I remember when Dan Coates made that comment. I don't think we were asleep. We dozed a little bit, maybe over the years with regard to China. And, this is self-criticism as much as anything else. There were moments when we probably assumed that, China could be sort of easily integrated into a network of institutions that we had done so much to build over the years. And, of course, China's got its own ambitions, and Xi Jinping doesn't lack for self-assurance these days as well. And it's a China that believes the wind is in its sails, I think, in a lot of respects as well. You're right, at a moment when we're having a hard time sustaining budgets for diplomacy and kind of getting in our own way as a professional foreign service and career civil service, China's expanding its diplomatic service. I remember a few years ago when I was deputy secretary going to represent the United States, lead our delegation to an African Union summit in Addis Ababa. And my basic role was to listen to Linda Thomas Greenfield and do everything that Linda said, which I found over the years, since we were A100 classmates, was always a smart philosophy. But I remember going there, and our delegation was like a dozen people. Hu Jintao, then the president of China, leads a Chinese delegation that must have numbered 500. They had just built the new African Union headquarters in Addis, which is sitting there gleaming as the backdrop. And I remember sending a note to, forget whether it was Secretary Kerry or Secretary Clinton at the time afterwards, saying, you know, we're in a pretty deep hole here, you know, in terms of our capacity to compete. But there's a lesson there. There's a reason the Chinese are, you know, investing in their diplomatic service. You look at the quality of Chinese diplomats, you know, their language capacities, you know, it was in some ways a much more introverted profession in China for a long time. They, you know, have a much more expansive view of what they can accomplish right now. And, you know, we can compete very well with other diplomatic services, but, you know, we need to pay attention to what others are doing.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say are the essential ingredients of a successful diplomat, and has it changed in recent years?
Well, I mean, I think I'll sound like too much of a traditionalist. I mean, I think the sort of basic qualities for effective diplomats haven't changed all that much over the years, in the sense that if we do our jobs well, you know, you've got to understand, you know, other societies and how to navigate them. And that means you need a facility in languages, you need a sense of history, a sense of a political culture at least. You need to know your own country too. You know, I grew up as an Army brat. My dad was a career Army officer, and I never thought it at the time. But actually it you know, opened my eyes to all sorts of different parts of the United States and American society. And it was a big asset, you know, as a diplomat overseas. Because you have to understand what you stand for and what other people see sometimes in American society as well. There's no substitute for judgment, I think, as a diplomat, you know, being able to connect ends and means. We get ourselves in a lot of trouble in foreign policy when we don't connect ends and means well. You know, you have to have a sense of self-confidence, I think, about the, you know, the leverage that the United States has to bring to bear. Helps to be able to listen too, which sometimes seems like an unnatural act for Americans and sometimes even for American diplomats. You have to appreciate, I think, that as Americans, I always found serving overseas, we get a lot farther through the power of our example than we do through the power of our preaching. We're pretty good sometimes at being kind of lecturing and patronizing. But the power of our example, which I think has been tarnished badly in recent years, is a pretty powerful instrument around the world. There are reasons that people line up to try to get visas to come to this country or to study in American universities. It's a sense of possibility in our society, warts and all, with all the mistakes we've made over the years. So having an appreciation of that, I think, is an important ingredient for good diplomats. It helps to look like the society you represent. When I entered the Foreign Service in the beginning of 1982, most American diplomats look like me. You know, 9 out of 10 American diplomats in the early 1980s were white. Only about a quarter were women. You know, we made painfully slow progress over the course of my 3.5 decades in the Foreign Service and in the civil service toward becoming more representative. You know, by the end of my time 4 years ago, the gender balance at least entry and sort of more junior and middle levels was close to 50-50 between women and men, far too inadequate at senior levels. But I fear today that process has been reversed. And you know, that's going to take a lot longer to fix than it's taken to break. And it matters. It's not just kind of morally right. It matters in practical terms, because we will get a lot farther overseas when we look like the society we represent.
Yeah.
But I do think on top of all those, so I'll set aside my traditionalist part, on top of that, as you look ahead at the Foreign Service, at least over the next couple of decades, you know, we need to find more creative ways to build modern skill sets on top of that more traditional foundation. In every area from technology, as I mentioned before, where we're going to have to be more creative, I think, in trying to bring people in for shorter periods of time, to look at some variant of the old mid-level entry program to attract people who have technological skills or skills in climate change and other issues that, you know, are really going to be front and center for American diplomacy over the next 20 or 30 years. I see the number of friends here who've worked on economic statecraft issues over the years, and we've generally talked a good game about that over the years, but we've never, I think, as effectively as we ought to, integrated economic issues into the sort of wider foreign policy spectrum of the United States, and that's increasingly important. And increasingly important, I think, if we want to help bridge the disconnect in our own society, you know, between people like me, card-carrying members of the Washington establishment, and lots of American citizens who, when we preach the virtues of disciplined American leadership in the world, in my experience, most Americans don't need to be convinced of the importance of American engagement in the world. They get that. They're just skeptical about the disciplined part, because all too often we've demonstrated indiscipline in Iraq in 2003 and the global financial crisis. So I think effective diplomats are going to have to understand, better than I did as a serving diplomat, the importance of bridging that disconnect and addressing some of those concerns.
Some people today are concerned that the applications for the Foreign Service are down quite a bit. There's still many people applying, and a small number get in. But are you concerned at all about the appeal of the career and the bringing in of the new generation?
No, I mean, I am concerned, and we should all be concerned, because after at least 2 decades where every year the number of applications, and to be honest, the quality of applicants rose steadily. You know, when I was both Undersecretary for Political Affairs and then Deputy Secretary, an overly long stretch of 7 years, you know, I would meet each of the A100 courses, and I remember leaving all of those encounters feeling glad that I didn't have to compete with them when I joined the Foreign Service, because it's really impressive. And so the drop-off in applications, and I hear this, as I'm sure many of you do when you go and talk to university audiences around the country, is not only deeply disappointing, but I think it's going to erode you know, the strength and the stature of the Foreign Service over time if we don't reverse it. I always encourage young people, and it's not, I think the average entering age is like 31 or 32, so it's not all young people out there that you encourage to take the Foreign Service exam, but I do that enthusiastically because I believe what I write about the significance of diplomacy. I wouldn't have traded a minute of it, well, maybe a few minutes in my career, but most minutes. I mean, I loved it. I was incredibly fortunate, and I think it's actually an exciting time for people coming into the State Department, because, you know, there's going to be a period of renewal, and that's actually an exciting time, I think.
So you remain an optimist.
I do. At the end of the day, if you read this book, plow through it, you know, you may not feel too uplifted by the end of it, but I do genuinely end on an optimistic note, because, you know, Tocqueville has this, Alexis de Tocqueville has this famous quote where he said, I'm paraphrasing it, but that, you know, it's not so much American exceptionalism that sets the United States apart, it's our capacity to learn from our mistakes and repair them. I wish we weren't testing that capacity, you know, as strenuously as we're doing today, but I do have a lot of faith in the resilience of our society. I do worry a little bit, though. I mean, I think our domestic institutions are pretty resilient. I worry a little about the international landscape, because we're digging a hole for ourselves right now, to be honest, and we will eventually stop digging. But when we do, we're going to climb back to the top of the hole and look out on a landscape that's hardened against our interests and in some ways against our values, because it's not like the rest of the world is going to sit by while we're digging that hole. You know, adversaries and rivals take advantage, allies start to lose faith and hedge, institutions start to teeter, and so there's an opportunity cost here too, internationally. But I'm still optimistic there about what we can accomplish.
Great, that's good to hear. And Ambassador Stevenson took that quote from your book, and she has that in her next column, because
it's a scary thought when people start quoting recovering diplomats. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things I want to make sure we have time to talk about, or just that I want to point out, is
Sure.
that I really appreciate in the back of the book, the appendix has a lot of declassified cables. I think they're all written by you, and
Most of them.
it's a really outstanding illustration of kind of the best of diplomatic thinking, and it's also an invitation to visit the new online archive of even more. There's about 100 cables online, and it's at burnsbackchannel.com, which is tied to the Carnegie website, and then there's videos. So I was browsing on the site last night, and I was drawn to the January 5th, 1993 parting thoughts message to incoming Secretary of State Warren Christopher. That was the week that I started A100, and I was thinking, you know, what a gift it would have been to be able to actually read that back then. But then I was realizing that, like so much of what you've written over the years, the wisdom and the relevance of what you said 26 years ago was strikingly applicable and smart today. So I printed out in the book they have little excerpts, and then online this is about a 22-page note to Secretary Christopher.
I don't advise people to do 22-page memos. Yeah. There
Well,
was
I
a summary.
do.
There was
I
a summary.
do.
Yeah.
Right. So you can see the summary. But in the last section of the cable, which is not in the book, you talked about how over 30 years you'd seen a number of overhauls at the State Department with very mixed results, and you had suggestions for the new secretary, including raise the profile of economic and global issues, cut back on states' Washington-based administrative tail while channeling more resources to the field, things like that. But with hope, you noted that this can be a frustrating building, the State Department, but it also holds enormous talent and energy. If you harness it early and give people a clear sense of direction and involvement, state can produce impressive results, which I thought was another
True.
optimistic and
Yeah.
good way to look at it. So my last question for this part of the event, thinking back on that 1993 wisdom, could you tell us, if you were still in government, what would you do or try to do about the state of the State Department today?
Sure. No, I mean, and it's kind of depressing, and it's in a way a self-indictment that we keep telling ourselves the same things over the years, and I didn't, just speaking for myself, didn't do nearly enough in positions where I probably could have done more to address some of those concerns. I'd say two things before getting to your question. I mean, first, there's always a temptation in writing something that at least is part memoir to write what you wish you had said or what you wish you had recommended. And I'm sure I fell prey to that, but I tried hard to be honest. And one way of doing that is to root it in documents and what you actually said, what you got wrong and what you got right. And I have colleagues in the State Department like Bihar Gadoni who were just wonderful in declassifying materials too. I mean, it really was, reminded me of the best of the State Department going through that process as well. So yeah, I mean, you can read them warts and all on the website, which is, it's not an imitation of Julian Assange because we did this properly. Actually, one of the perverse side effects of WikiLeaks I found, and it was a painful experience because I remember being deputized by Secretary Clinton to go try to talk the New York Times Washington bureau chief out of running a number of those cables, which I was a dismal failure at. But one of the perverse side effects of WikiLeaks I found over the years is people who read what we all wrote and sent in and said, well, you guys actually could write, and you were pretty honest.
Yeah.
And it was actually what you said publicly and what you were reporting privately was pretty consistent. I've had lots of foreign correspondents and journalist friends of mine. I said, well, what did you think we were doing all of those years? So that perverse side of, benefit didn't seem so obvious at the time when we were going through that. Anyway, when I think back to that transition memo that I wrote for Larry Eagleburger, who was then, the exiting Secretary of State for incoming Secretary Warren Christopher, I have long thought that, we add too many layers, especially in Washington, to the State Department. It's kind of like, repainting your bedroom too many times, and you need to strip away some of those layers. I remember one of my last months as deputy secretary, I got a memo on one of the most mundane issues imaginable. It was a half a page long. Attached to it was a page and a half of clearances. And the problem with that, as all of you know very well, is you tend to beat down any sense of pride of authorship, either the prose or the recommendations, when you know you're going to have 19 other people fiddling with your judgment or your prose. And we haven't done nearly as good a job to whittle away at some of those layers. I think in the broadest terms, I always found over the course of my career that the State Department is capable and continues to produce incredibly talented people, who can be innovative and entrepreneurial and oftentimes quite courageous, serving overseas or voicing their opinions in Washington. As an institution, however, we are rarely accused of being too agile or too full of initiative. And I would sit in hour after hour of, cabinet level or sub-cabinet level meetings in the White House Situation Room where other agencies, the cottage industry was dumped on the State Department because we're too passive aggressive or don't show enough initiative. And there was just enough of a kernel of truth in that sometimes that has always driven home to me that we don't always do as good a job as we can at tapping into that. And I think one of the answers has to be to delayer. I mean, over the course of my 3.5 decades, 7th floor staffs got way too big. I tried when I was in, P and D to keep relatively small staffs, which meant I had extremely talented but overworked staffs, which I deeply appreciated. But in general, I think we've become too top-heavy. I think, country teams overseas have always struck me as being the part of the interagency process that works best from the point of view of the State Department, because good ambassadors don't wave around their letter from the president. They can use that country team not only to effectively implement policy, but also to shape how it's made in Washington if you're, energetic about it. So that the tools exist. But even though, people from George Kennan to George Shultz, when he was secretary, liked to talk about diplomats as gardeners, that were constantly pruning the international landscape and investing in possibilities and cutting back on threats, we haven't always done such a good job tending to our own patch of the garden in the State Department. And I think there are some pretty straightforward ways in which we could, I think, make the department a more nimble, more agile institution than we've become. We're never going to regain the kind of near monopoly on insight and access overseas or in shaping the policy process in Washington that we once may have had, or at least imagined we had. There are just too many players out there now. But what sets us apart at our best is we understand how to navigate foreign landscapes in a way nobody else in Washington should understand. So good ambassadors, good country teams aren't just going to admire the problem. They're going to take some risks sometimes. I mean, one of the diplomats I most admired over the years was Tom Pickering. And Pickering, as many of you know, never wanted to get an instruction from Washington that he hadn't first written or shaped himself. And that's what good ambassadors to this day, I think, ought to at least aspire to do. We're not all Tom Pickerings, but we ought to be able to do more of that. And I'm sure there's still illustrations of that today, but that's what ought to set us apart.
Yeah. Well, that is a great note to stop this part of the talk, and I think now we can move to Q&A. So first of all, thank you
Sure.
for that. Knowing this group, I'm sure there are a lot of questions for you. We have a microphone set up in the middle. If you could just go to the microphone and make a line, and we will do that for 20 minutes or so.
If I haven't stunned you all into silence, sorry. I used to have that effect on people when I was across the street, but.
So I would just make a plea that you should, everyone should please ask a question as opposed to making a statement, if you don't mind. So
Hi, Tom.
thanks.
How you doing?
I actually have two very quick questions. The first is, Bill, would you have written this book if Secretary Clinton had won the election? And the second is, kind of more of an admin thing.
Yeah.
You came in '82, and many of us have been told, boy, you should write your memoirs. Now, you know, in my case, I know my mother, my kids, and my mother-in-law would read it. But the question I have is, you have a lot of cables. How did you know what to ask for? How did you kind of keep a diary of, you know, organizing yourself?
Yeah. Well, and the second question first, Tom, it's a really good one. I never kept a diary as a diplomat. You know, to be honest, our generation of diplomats had that kind of beaten out of us, watching some of our colleagues get their diaries, brought before a court or the Congress or something else. And so I think, you know, you don't have what was a practice for 2 or 3 generations before of people who did that. The one thing, I had kind of a slow exit from the State Department, and so the one thing I did, working with some terrific people on my staff when I was Deputy Secretary, is organize my stuff. I wasn't sure I was ever going to try to write about my experience as a diplomat, but I'd always found that, you know, even with Secretaries of State, if you don't organize your stuff, classified as well as unclassified, that you can't take with you, it's really hard to track it down afterwards, just because it goes in a lot of different directions. And so we had organized that so I knew where to find it when I worked with, you know, with wonderful colleagues like Bihar. So that helped a lot. And then I, you know, managed to get some things declassified, which made then the clearance process, you know, a lot more straightforward than it would have been. I probably would have tried to write something eventually, because I love to write, and, you know, about my experience as a diplomat. I wouldn't have written the same book, I don't think. The argument, you know, when I started writing this, I thought it'd be more of a memoir and less of an argument, but, you know, my concern has grown over the last couple of years. And as I said, I'm not trying to suggest that the drift in our profession started in January 2017. We've wrestled with it, I think, at different times. But it's accelerated in ways that I think are really harmful. And so that, once I started writing that, that's what animated this book and made it different than it would otherwise have been.
Thanks, Bill.
Hi,
Hi.
Matthew Sada.
Hi, Matthew. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. I wanted to ask about your observations on the personnel system.
Mhm.
You had written in your Foreign Affairs article that the State Department's personnel system is far too rigid and anachronistic. The evaluation process is wholly incapable of providing honest feedback or incentives for improved performance. You talked a little bit about how in your previous positions at the Undersecretary, the Deputy Secretary, you perhaps had an opportunity to help shape that personnel system
Right.
indirectly. What, 2 things. One, can we do for our senior leaders in the department to incentivize them to look at the personnel system for those that are not responsible for it?
Right.
And the second thing is in your current capacity at Carnegie. Carnegie, you know, over the years has contributed a number of studies that have actually helped to build the personnel system as we know it today, including before the Foreign Service Act of 1980.
Mhm.
Is there anything afoot or that could be done in your current capacity to help to address some of these personnel issues?
You could. I mean, you know, there is, as you were suggesting, there's a kind of depressing similarity in, you know, usually exiting Secretaries of State do these valedictory studies on the future of the State Department, and if you read them, and I've read most of them over the years, it's depressing the amount of consistency in them, including about the personnel system sometimes too. So the challenge is early on in a new administration, not as a valedictory effort, to focus on those issues. I do think there's a role, you know, outside of government. The American Academy of Diplomacy, I know, has been involved in that kind of an effort. And I think if Carnegie can, you know, do something that adds value and doesn't just trip over, you know, what others are doing, we certainly will. I think it's easy to get lost in the minutia of some of those kind of studies too. I think it's important to keep focused on some of those bigger issues of delayering and the kinds of things that I think would make us a more agile institution than we've been, you know, over the course of my career as well. You know, the evaluation process here, I'm talking about the Foreign Service system, you know, is always frustrating because, you know, people, you know, if you're sitting on boards, you've really got to read between the lines sometimes, you know, the difference between, superlative and unmatched and just really good or something. I mean, and that's because there's been such an inflation, I think, sometimes, even with efforts episodically to address that. The Foreign Service is a pretty small institution. I don't know whether 8,500, I think, FSO generalists now. So it becomes, especially the more senior you get, it becomes much more a question of corridor reputation and everything else. And that has its pluses and its minuses, too. And so what you need, to answer your question about senior leadership, I think, are people who will look at the long term. Look at people not just when you're trying to put together a list for a chief of mission assignment, but you're looking at people who at the mid-levels clearly have a lot of potential. And you're looking at what kind of career path is going to give them the diversity of experience and challenge them in ways where you really can tell, when you get to the chief of mission list, whether they're the kind of people who will excel as chiefs of mission. And that requires a lot of effort. I mean, it requires almost, I used to chair the DEAC committee looking at chief of mission jobs, and one of the things we tried to do, and I never did it as well as I should have, is before you start going through those lists, try to look at the pool of people, 60, 70 people, whatever it is, who are just short of, chief of mission possibilities, but that you want to groom as the next generation of people you want to populate those lists. And then think systematically in ways we oftentimes don't do in the department about what kind of assignments make the most sense. That requires a certain amount of attention from very senior levels of the department. But it's a healthy instinct, I think, to try to do that.
Thanks.
Sure.
Hi. Megan Tetrick.
Hi.
I wanted to push a little bit more on the last question and
Yeah.
also your comment about kind of things that you think you may have had opportunities to do in the past to improve the Foreign Service and the State Department that you didn't do.
Right.
If you'd be willing to share with us 2 or 3 very specific concrete recommendations that you think still apply and especially apply now in this environment that maybe some of us in this room can help enact.
Yeah, I mean, some of them on the delayering part, some of them you can control. I mean, it doesn't depend on the sort of political leadership of Secretary of State or others. I mean, I mentioned before 7th floor staffs, some of which have just gotten too big, and it's not hard to cut back on those. You can do that. You don't need a Secretary of State to pay attention to those. There are too many DASs in my experience. And again, I'm 4 years out of government, so I, maybe showing how outdated I am. But I remember kidding my friend who was the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs at the time that at one point they had, I think, 7 DASs and 7 what used to be called country directorates, and that's crazy. I mean, the pyramid should be getting narrower as you go up, I think. That's something that's also, it's within the capacity of the department to control. Now, you need political leaderships that are going to pay attention to that because, of course, the story of the last couple decades has been, adding kind of non-career DAS positions. And so then the dirty little game is if you cut positions, you end up cutting career positions and you add to that imbalance. But those are 2 small but I think significant examples of the kinds of things that you can do to make the place a little bit more agile.
Thank you.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Bill. Mary Warlick.
How you doing?
Yes, good, thank you. Yes, so thanks very much for being with all of us today, and,
Sure.
and most of all for taking the time to write the book and sharing with us all of your very valuable insights. My question is, as you looked at the issue of restoring American diplomatic engagement, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the age-old issue, which you just touched on briefly, of sort of states' role and influence in the policy-making process on international issues. You're right to say that there are many more agencies now involved in some aspect of international engagement and issues across the world. But your thoughts on the current state of play, where obviously a number of issues are being strongly led by folks at the White House or elsewhere, but also drawing from your experience having worked with a number of secretaries of state,
Yeah.
what you saw really work best in terms of not only having a strong relationship between the incumbent Secretary of State and the President, but other elements where we really were able to, carry very strong water on the full range of international issues, including economic ones. Thank you.
Yeah, what varies a lot, I mean, in terms of the department's clout, the relationship between a secretary and a president, is enormously important too. I start the book with an episode from my service for Secretary Baker, in the George H.W. Bush administration. In many ways, that, in my experience, was the peak of American power and diplomacy in the world. But, especially in his first year and a half, Secretary Baker was not exactly enamored of much of the institution. He had a reputation early on of being fairly closed in his view. That changed over time. I mean, I think he genuinely came to appreciate the quality of Foreign Service officers and, stayed in that era, was a pretty formidable player. Partly that was about Baker himself. He was not somebody anybody messed around with, either in Washington or on the international landscape. I mean, he disagreed sometimes with Brent Scowcroft and others, but it was such a high caliber of people on that team. And I think President Bush 41 set such a professional tone in how the United States dealt with the world that it made for a high point in American diplomacy, and hence huge opportunities for the department, I think, and for individual career officers to play a role in that. I've worked in other eras in Washington where there was bloody combat. We spent more time when I was running NEA, the Near East Bureau for Secretary Powell in the first Bush 43 administration. We spent more time arguing with ourselves in Washington than we did with people in the Middle East. It was literally open combat with Secretary Rumsfeld's Pentagon, with the Vice President's staff sometimes. And in those kind of eras, the one thing I think you do want to do is encourage an atmosphere where people feel that they can express their concerns. When they disagree with policy, they feel that there's an atmosphere in which, however inconvenient it might be, they can express those concerns. Because a department that beats down that sense, that tries to intimidate people, that engages in what, again, just to be blunt about it, I think has been a particularly pernicious practice over the last couple of years of going after individual career officers because they worked on controversial policies in the last administration. That debases an institution over time. So you have to try to create an atmosphere in which people are going to challenge conventional wisdom sometimes too. That brings out the best, I think, in individual officers as well. Hey.
Hi, Bill.
Nice to see you.
Good. Effective diplomacy. If I haven't read the book, so I don't know whether you get into it, but could you elaborate a bit on the importance of the personal? How do you reach a foreign interlocutor, or even in the interagency for that matter, to get them on receive for whatever the American message of the day is? And I'll just share a brief story, which I've shared with you before. An Iranian think tank colleague who was well plugged into your interlocutors during the secret talks shared with me a story about how effective you were in terms of articulating the American position and where you wanted to go and where the red lines were, etc. Because, in his words, you treated me like a fellow human being. And the importance of respect, other respect, mutual respect. In terms of getting a difficult interlocutor to give the time of day to what you were trying to advance. And that's an important lesson, I think, for your more junior colleagues who are still in the trenches. And if you could just elaborate a bit more on that, while at the same time protecting your flanks back in the home office in Washington, that Bill Burns hasn't gone soft on whomever.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you didn't mention that story when I was still serving in government. It wouldn't have done much for my street credibility, and especially
You
on
made
the
that
Hill.
comment, I believe, at the time.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think personal relationships and credibility, for want of a better term, do matter. As I mentioned before, you do got to be able to listen. You need, I think, effective diplomats have a sense of strategic empathy. In other words, an understanding of what animates, even the sharpest of adversaries. because everybody is going to have their sense of grievances. Certainly in the case of the U.S.-Iranian relationship, it's a minefield. And when we started the secret talks, nuclear talks with the Iranians, nobody had a good roadmap. So, we hadn't had sustained diplomatic contact with one another for 35 years. And so when we first went into that isolated, Omani military officers' guest house on the Arabian Sea, where it was 130 degrees Fahrenheit outside, so there was nothing much to do other than get to know one another, there was a lot of tension in the room. But, I think over time we built up, moving on to the next phase of the secret talks when Javad Zarif was the foreign minister and his two deputies, we built up what I wouldn't call trust, but was a certain amount of mutual respect, at least. And that's really important. And personal relationships in diplomacy, again, as all of you know as well as I do, matter all the way up to the top. I did not take issue with President Trump wanting to meet with Kim Jong-un. I mean, it's not like any of us had a pristine record on North Korea issues over the previous 30 years. The problem, though, is when you over-personalize diplomacy and it becomes an exercise in narcissism, not in institutions. And that's what I'm afraid happens with Kim Jong-un. I'm afraid that that's what happens with Vladimir Putin. I mean, remember watching in Helsinki, when President Trump and President Putin did their press conference after their summit meeting, and as President Trump threw under the bus 17 U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies, in an effort to ingratiate himself with Putin, if you could have had a cartoon balloon coming out of Putin's head, it would have said, "What an easy mark," because he sees that as a sign of weakness and manipulability. So I say all that only because I think, as important as personal relationships are, that you also have to balance them with the hard realities of leverage of one kind or another, that ends up combining to make effective diplomacy.
My name is Mike Anderson. I'm a retired public diplomacy
Nice to
officer.
see you.
My question is about the noon press briefings.
Yes.
We don't seem to have them very often anymore. Do you think this
I've
is,
noticed that.
have they outlived their usefulness, or?
I hope not. I mean, I always spent in 3.5 decades as a diplomat. I always counted my blessings that I never had that job, because it's a really hard job, and it's one thing for all of us as desk officers to write talking points for a press briefing. It's another to have to stand up there and take the incoming. Having said all that, and it's true of, the encounters that all of us as diplomats or as State Department officials have with the media, it's incredibly important. Because I always found over the years, if you can't explain publicly your policy, there's generally a problem with your policy. And you have to be able to absorb pointed questions, sometimes snarky ones, but if you want to be able to engage the American public or the wider international public about a policy, if you can't explain what you're about effectively, your policy and your diplomacy is going to suffer over time. So I think it's really unfortunate, is the short answer, that they're not as regular as they used to be. They're not a perfect instrument. But in any democracy like ours, I think they're incredibly important to do that. Same is true at the White House. It's not fun, but it's a part of the profession, and it's a part of what makes for effective diplomacy or foreign policy. Hey,
Bill, Piper Campbell.
nice to see you, Piper.
I want to try to sort of pull the thread and then actually connect the thread on two things that we've covered. The first is, as you noted, growth in the importance of technology, climate change, those not necessarily being areas where the State Department currently has great strength. And as we look at sort of the expansion of actors and look at both of those areas, climate change and technology, they seem like areas where part of what the State Department's going to need to be able to do is to be able to find partners and operate quite effectively with not only across government, but with non-governmental
Right.
organizations, companies, others who are interested in those areas. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and specifically from your position at Carnegie, are you looking at, or do you see ways that institutions like Carnegie can help the State Department to increase its capacities and to find the ways to build those networked relationships to better focus on those areas, climate change and technology?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because you're right. You're not going to just import into the State Department the sort of full range of expertise in new technologies, or in climate change for that matter. You know, at its best, I think at our best, American diplomats are kind of conductors of the orchestra. So, you know, you want to be able, if you're dealing with foreign governments or international institutions, that's our stock and trade. So we should be able to help orchestrate, you know, a lot of that technical capacity to achieve good results for the United States and for international rules of the road. And you know, how we do that is going to be complicated. I mean, I think the department is going to have to import some of those skill sets and probably be a little bit more creative, given the difficulty of attracting people than we've been able to do before. We've managed it in different eras in the State Department to do that, when we recognize the need for those kind of skills. I think there's a broader disconnect between the world of public policy and the world of not just Silicon Valley. I mean, there are lots of places that are tech hubs, but especially Silicon Valley right now too. We set up a new program at Carnegie, which, you know, is aimed at looking at technology and its impact on international affairs, and there are lots of our peer institutions are doing the same thing. But it's an effort to begin to bridge that divide a little bit. Because I remember 5 or 6 years ago, when I was still in government and I'd go out to Silicon Valley, you know, most of the time people, especially the founders generation of the big tech companies, their view was just stay the hell away from us. You know, we're revolutionaries, we're changing the world, we don't need you, get out of our way. And similarly, to be fair, in public policy, the view was, well, you guys don't understand how public policy works, so, you know, there's not much need to pay attention to you either. I think on both sides, there's a realization now that wasn't true even 5 or 6 years ago of the significance of working together on a lot of those issues. So I think the department's role, it seems to me, you know, is to be the facilitator of that in some ways too, internationally. And, you know, places like Carnegie, I think, can make a contribution, especially in thinking about how you frame some of those big issues. That's what I always looked, you know, when I was in government, would look to think tanks or public policy institutions to do. Because, you know, you become, as many of you are to this day, you know, you become captive to your inbox. You know, you're dealing with the latest crisis or the latest problem. There's not, even when I worked in the policy planning staff, you know, long-range thinking was next week, oftentimes. So, you know, institutions like Carnegie, I think, can help in providing that kind of a framing or perspective.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll
Hi.
go to the
Hi,
signing.
Greg Dilloway.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you. You've made the point several times in your book, talking with Putin, talking with Gaddafi, talking with the Iranians. You made it clear that your job was not to be friendly and make friends with people. Your job was to achieve your objectives. And I think you did this a terrific way, and I haven't really read it the same way in the past. Now, on your speaking tour over the last several weeks since the book was published, do you get a sense, this is a slight transition, that people with open minds about the role of the U.S. in the world are hearing what you're having to say, are reading your book, or are you kind of preaching to the community that already believes in that stuff?
I hope so. You know, my purpose, as I said at the beginning, was to try to bring diplomacy to life for a wider audience, you know, so that it's not us talking to each other, much as I enjoy that. But I mean, I think that's, in a way, that's the service that books like this, and there are lots of other ones, you know, can provide. And I've been struck, it's only been out 3 weeks or so, by the number of people who pay attention to that, even to the point that you made. Because, you know, one of the great caricatures of diplomacy is that it's just about talking nicely to people, or it's a kind of, you know, a profession of manners in a way. And sometimes it is, that's true, but, you know, oftentimes it's a pretty hard-nosed business. And by that I don't mean you're throwing your briefing book at somebody, you know, across a table, although I've seen very effective negotiators do that sometimes. But it really is about harnessing that leverage. And, you know, you can become friends. I've become friends with lots of the people I dealt with over the years. But friendship's not the point of the exercise. You know, the point of the exercise is advance your country's interests. And diplomats who forget that generally run into trouble, or they fall prey to clientitis or all those other afflictions that, you know, all of us have had at one time or another.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. So
Thank you.
thank you so much.
Thank you all
This
very
was
much.
great.
Thanks.